The people of Atlantis went to sleep that night, believing their empire was eternal. Their towers still glowed, their oceans were calm, their power felt unstoppable. But something had already changed. Ancient accounts describe strange signs in the sky, unnatural stillness in the sea, and a silence that felt heavier than fear. What if the destruction of Atlantis did not begin with fire, but with a warning? Imagine standing on the highest tower of the most advanced civilization on Earth, watching the horizon darken in a way you have never seen before, just the sky shifting. By sunrise, Atlantis would be gone. Tonight, we reconstruct what may have happened. During the final hours before the fall, the decisions made, the signs ignored, and the moment everything changed forever. Because sometimes civilizations do not fall in chaos. They fall in silence. The streets of Atlantis glimmered with light as night descended. Merchants closed their stalls, nobles retreated to their marble halls, and priests whispered prayers to gods they believed would never abandon them. The city's canals reflected the glow of towers, shimmering like veins of fire running through stone. To its people, this was proof of eternity, a civilization too advanced, too powerful, too divine, to ever collapse. Yet beneath the calm unease stirred. Fishermen along the coast noticed the waves had stilled, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. Astronomers gazed upward and saw stars flicker strangely, their constellations shifting in ways no chart had ever recorded. And in the temples, priests felt a silence so profound it seemed to press against the walls. Still, the city celebrated its greatness. Musicians played in the plazas, laughter echoed through the streets, and children dreamed of futures in a world they believed would never change. Atlantis was eternal, or so they thought. But in the shadows, the first cracks had already appeared. The horizon darkened, not with storm clouds, but with something heavier, unexplainable. A silence spread across the city, subtle yet undeniable. It was not fear, not yet. It was the quiet before history itself shifted. By dawn, Atlantis would face its final night, and the world would never be the same. If you love mythology and history from all cultures and forbidden ancient stories, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And let me know where you're watching from, whether it's your couch, your kitchen, or hiding under the blanket, pretending you're not binge-watching history at 3 a.m. Atlantis was not just a city, it was a vision of perfection. Marble towers rose like frozen flames, their peaks catching the glow of moonlight. Bridges arched across canals that shimmered with reflections of fire and stone. The streets pulsed with life. Merchants called out their final trades. Children chased laughter through plazas, and nobles retreated into halls carved with impossible precision. To its people, this was eternity made visible. The Atlanteans believed their empire was untouchable. Their engineers had bent rivers into obedience. Their astronomers charted the heavens with flawless accuracy. Their priests claimed the gods themselves had blessed their city. Every wall, every tower, every canal was proof of their mastery. They did not see fragility. They saw permanence. But beneath this confidence lay arrogance. The leaders of Atlantis spoke of their city as if it were immune to time, immune to nature, immune to fate itself. They believed no storm could break their walls, no enemy could breach their defenses, no disaster could erase their name. To them, Atlantis was not just a city, it was destiny. That night, As the glow of torches flickered across marble, the people celebrated their greatness. Musicians filled the plazas with sound, dancers spun beneath the towers, and laughter echoed through the streets. The empire was eternal, or so they thought. Yet, in the silence between songs, unease lingered. Fishermen whispered of waves that had stilled, as if the ocean itself had fallen asleep. Astronomers spoke of stars shifting in ways no chart could explain. Priests felt a heaviness in the air, a silence pressing against their temples. But their warnings were drowned out by celebration. The city believed it was eternal, and that belief was its greatest weakness. For eternity does not belong to empires. It belongs to silence, to the ocean, to the forces that wait patiently for arrogance to falter. Atlantis stood proud, blind to the horizon that was already darkening. Its towers glowed, its people laughed, its leaders boasted. But eternity was not theirs to claim. By dawn, the illusion would shatter, and the city that believed it was eternal would face the truth. Nothing lasts forever. As the night deepened over Atlantis, the heavens began to betray the city. A familiar canopy of stars turned restless. Constellations flickered, their positions bending, as though the sky itself was being rewritten. On the highest towers, scholars gathered with scrolls and instruments, their voices trembling. They compared notes, realizing the stars were not where they should be. Some stars burned brighter than ever, while others dimmed into near invisibility. A comet streaked across the horizon, its tail glowing crimson, unsettling even rational minds. The people below noticed two children pointed upward, asking why the moon seemed larger. The moon seemed heavier, as if it were leaning closer to the earth. Merchants paused mid-trade, staring at a sky that no longer felt like a ceiling but a warning. Priests whispered that the gods were shifting their gaze, turning away from Atlantis. But the leaders dismissed these fears. To them, the sky was spectacle, not omen. They told the people to celebrate, to see the strange lights as blessings, as proof of their city's eternal favor. Yet the silence in their voices betrayed unease. The signs grew stranger. A faint hum seemed to ripple through the air, a vibration that resonated in the bones of those who listened closely. Birds flew in chaotic patterns, abandoning their nests, circling wildly as if confused by the heavens. Even the ocean reflected the disturbance, its surface shimmering with distorted light, as though the stars themselves were sinking into the waves. For those who believed in omens, the message was clear. The sky was warning Atlantis, but the city, proud and eternal in its own eyes, chose denial. They celebrated beneath a sky that was unraveling, blind to the truth. The heavens were no longer steady. The signs in the sky were not random. They were the first cracks in the illusion of eternity. And though the people laughed, danced, and sang beneath the shifting stars, the silence of the heavens carried a weight heavier than fear. By dawn, the sky would no longer be a mystery. It would be a verdict. As the stars shifted above Atlantis, the ocean below began to betray its own secret. The waves that had once carried the rhythm of the city's life fell still, as if the sea itself had forgotten how to breathe. Fishermen along the coast whispered in disbelief. The tide had frozen, the currents had vanished. The familiar roar of water against stone had been replaced by a silence so complete it felt alive. The silence spread across the city like a shadow. Canals that usually rippled with movement became mirrors. Ships anchored in the harbors swayed gently, but the water beneath them did not stir. Even the seabirds, restless and loud by nature, abandoned their cries, circling in uneasy patterns before vanishing into the night. At first, the people dismissed it. They told themselves it was calm, a gift from the gods, a night of peace. But those who listened closely felt something different, a heaviness pressing against their ears, a silence that seemed to hum beneath the surface. It was not the quiet of rest, it was the quiet of anticipation. Priests gathered in temples, their voices hushed as they debated the meaning of this unnatural stillness. Some claimed the gods were watching, others feared the ocean was preparing to rise. Astronomers compared the silence to the strange signs in the sky, wondering if the heavens and the sea were conspiring together. But the leaders dismissed these warnings, insisting that Atlantis was eternal, immune to omens. Yet the silence grew heavier. It seeped into the streets, into the plazas, into the very bones of the city. Musicians faltered mid-song, their instruments sounding hollow against the weight of the air. Children stopped their games, sensing something they could not name. And in the harbors, sailors stared at the unmoving water, their hands trembling as they touched the surface, expecting ripples that never came. The silence was not absence, it was presence, a force waiting, watching, pressing against the city with invisible weight. Atlantis had always believed the ocean was its ally, its protector, its endless source of power. But that night, the ocean revealed another face, one that was colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. The unnatural silence was the first betrayal, and though the people tried to ignore it, to laugh, to sing, to celebrate, the truth lingered in the air. The ocean was no longer calm. It was waiting. By dawn, the silence would break. And when it did, Atlantis would never hear the same sounds again. Inside the marble halls of Atlantis, the rulers gathered. The silence outside had already unsettled the city. But within these chambers, the weight of choice pressed heavier than stone. Torches flickered against walls carved with symbols of eternity, casting shadows. These shadows seemed to mock the very idea of permanence. The High Council sat in a circle, their voices sharp, their pride unbroken. Some demanded calm, insisting the silence was nothing more than nature's pause. Others whispered of omens, of signs in the sky, and seas that no empire could ignore. The debate was not about truth, it was about survival, and whether survival required action or denial. The king, draped in robes of gold, spoke with authority. He declared Atlantis eternal, untouchable, chosen by the gods. His words were meant to steady the council, but his eyes betrayed unease. He had seen the horizon darken, felt the silence pressing against the city, and though he spoke of strength, he feared weakness. One advisor urged evacuation. If the ocean rises, if the heavens shift, we must prepare, he pleaded. But his voice was drowned by laughter from others who mocked his caution. Atlantis does not flee, they said. Atlantis commands. Another proposed sacrifice offerings to the gods to restore balance. Priests nodded, their faces pale, their faith shaken. Yet the council dismissed them, unwilling to admit that their power might not be enough. The final decision was arrogance disguised as confidence. The leaders chose denial. They ordered celebrations to continue, demanded silence from dissenters, and proclaimed that Atlantis would stand forever. To the people, they offered reassurance. To themselves, some leaders looked to the sea and wondered if they had sealed the city's fate. Others whispered of escape, of secret plans to flee should the silence break. And the king, though he spoke of eternity, felt the weight of history pressing against him. The final decisions of Atlantis's leaders were not born of wisdom. They were born of fear of losing power, fear of admitting weakness, fear of facing the truth. And in choosing denial, they ensured the city would be unprepared. By dawn, the leaders' words would echo as betrayal. And the people who believed in eternity would discover that their rulers had chosen pride over survival. The silence gripping Atlantis was broken by movement. The ocean, once still as glass, began to stir in ways that defied nature. At first, it was subtle, ripples spreading without wind, currents shifting against the tide. Soon, the sea revealed something far more unsettling. Fishermen watched in disbelief as schools of fish surged toward the shore, fleeing from the deep, chased by an unseen predator. Whales breached in frantic arcs, their cries echoing across the water with a desperation that chilled even the bravest sailors. The ocean was alive, restless, and its movements carried a warning no one could ignore. In the harbors, ships swayed violently. The water beneath them churned, rising and falling in uneven pulses, as if the sea was breathing. Sailors clutched ropes, staring at waves that seemed to move with intent, not chance. Some whispered the ocean was trying to speak. The canals of Atlantis reflected this chaos. Water surged against stone walls, climbing higher than it should, then retreating with unnatural speed. Merchants abandoned their stalls as the canals overflowed, spilling into streets that had never known flooding. Children cried as the familiar waterways turned hostile, their calm beauty replaced by unpredictable violence. Priests declared the ocean was angry, demanding offerings to restore balance. Astronomers feared sea and sky were conspiring together, but the leaders, still clinging to denial, insisted the city was safe. They told the people to remain calm, to trust in Atlantis's eternal strength. Yet the ocean did not calm. Its movements grew sharper, more deliberate. Waves rose in sudden walls, then collapsed into silence. Currents twisted in spirals, pulling debris into whirlpools that appeared and vanished without warning. The sea was no longer a passive force. It was active, alive, and unpredictable. For those who watched closely, the message was clear. The ocean was preparing for something. Its strange activity was not random, but deliberate, a prelude to a storm that had not yet arrived. Atlantis had always believed the sea was its ally, its endless source of power. But that night, the ocean revealed its true nature. Not ally, not enemy, but force. The strange activity in the ocean was the second betrayal. And though the city tried to ignore it, the truth was undeniable. The sea was no longer calm, it was restless, and it was waiting. As the ocean churned with strange movements and the sky burned with unfamiliar signs, voices of caution rose across Atlantis. Fishermen begged the council to listen, describing waters that no longer obeyed the tides. Astronomers warned of constellations shifting, of stars flickering in unnatural patterns. Priests whispered of silence, pressing against the temples, a heaviness that felt like divine judgment. But the city's leaders silenced them. To admit danger was to admit weakness, and Atlantis had built its identity on the illusion of eternity. The king declared the omens meaningless, the silence harmless, the ocean loyal. His words echoed through the plazas, carried by heralds, who reassured the people that their empire was untouchable. The warnings were ignored. In the streets, merchants closed their stalls early, uneasy with the restless canals. Mothers pulled children indoors, sensing danger in the air. Sailors refused to take their ships out, fearing currents that moved without wind. Yet the city celebrated still. Musicians played louder, dancers spun faster, and laughter echoed through the plazas as if joy could drown out fear. Those who spoke of danger were mocked. Atlantis does not fall, the leaders said. Atlantis commands. Priests who urged offerings to the gods were dismissed as superstitious. Astronomers who charted the shifting heavens were silenced, their scrolls locked away. Fishermen who warned of fleeing animals were ignored, their voices lost in the roar of denial. But the signs did not fade. The ocean grew restless, the sky grew darker, and the silence pressed heavier. The warnings were not whispers, they were shouts. Yet Atlantis, blinded by pride, refused to hear them. The tragedy of Atlantis was not that the signs were hidden, it was that they were ignored. The city had been given warnings in the sky, in the sea, in the silence, but its leaders chose arrogance over caution, and in that choice they sealed the fate of their people. By dawn, the warnings would no longer be whispers, they would be reality. And Atlantis, deafened by pride, would face the truth it had refused to hear. Atlantis had always believed its strength was unshakable. Its towers glowed with energy drawn from crystals said to harness the earth itself. Its canals pulsed with currents engineered to obey human command. Its armies stood ready, their weapons forged from metals unknown to the outside world. To the Atlanteans, this was proof of eternity, power that could never fail. But that night, as the ocean stirred and the sky shifted, their power revealed its limits. The great towers, once radiant, flickered. Their light dimmed, as if the crystals themselves sensed the silence pressing against the city. Engineers rushed to stabilize the flow of energy, but the systems resisted, humming with a discordant vibration that no one could explain. The canals, designed to channel water with precision, overflowed unpredictably, spilling into streets that had never known flood. The very technology that had defined Atlantis began to falter. Priests gathered in temples, chanting prayers to awaken the gods. They believed the city's power was divine, a gift that could shield them from disaster. But the silence answered with nothing. The gods did not speak, the crystals did not respond, the towers continued to dim. In the council chambers, leaders demanded proof of strength. They ordered demonstrations of Atlantis's might, machines activated, weapons displayed, canals redirected. But each attempt revealed weakness. The machines sputtered, the weapons glowed faintly, the canals resisted control. The power that had built Atlantis was no longer theirs to command. The people watched in disbelief. For generations, they had trusted in their city's brilliance, believing no force could challenge it. Yet that night, they saw the truth. Atlantis's power was not eternal. It was fragile, vulnerable, and powerless against forces greater than themselves. The tragedy was not that Atlantis lacked strength. It was that its strength could not save them. The ocean did not care for their towers. The sky did not bow to their crystals. The silence did not break for their prayers. Their power, once unstoppable, was useless against the weight of nature itself. By dawn, the people would understand what their leaders refused to admit. Atlantis's brilliance was not protection, it was illusion. And when the silence broke, no tower, no canal, no weapon would stand against it. The power that couldn't save them was the third betrayal, and it ensured that when the fall began, Atlantis would face it unarmed. Despite the silence pressing against the city, despite the restless ocean and the shifting sky, Atlantis chose joy over fear. The leaders, desperate to maintain control, ordered a grand celebration, a festival of light, music, and revelry. The plazas filled with torches, their flames dancing against marble walls. Musicians struck chords that echoed through the canals. Dancers spun in circles, their movements defiant against the heaviness in the air. Merchants reopened their stalls, offering food and wine. The people clung to the illusion. They laughed louder, sang stronger, and cheered longer, as though joy itself could silence the warnings. Children chased each other through the streets, their laughter piercing the stillness. Couples embraced beneath glowing towers, whispering promises. The city celebrated not because it was safe, but because it was afraid. Yet beneath the music, the silence lingered. The ocean surged unpredictably, its waves rising and falling in unnatural rhythms. The stars above flickered, their constellations bending into unfamiliar shapes. And in the temples, priests prayed desperately. The final celebration was not joy, it was denial. It was the city's last attempt to pretend eternity was theirs, to believe that no force could challenge their greatness. But the truth was already written in the sky, in the sea. As midnight passed, the celebration reached its peak. Fireworks lit the sky, their sparks reflecting in the restless ocean. Music thundered, laughter echoed, and the people danced as if the night would never end. But in the shadows, some watched with dread, knowing the celebration was not a triumph, but a farewell. The final celebration was Atlantis's last act of defiance. A city that believed it was eternal chose to laugh in the face of warning, to dance in the shadow of silence, to sing against the tide of fate. But joy could not save them. By dawn, the music would fade, the torches would die, and the city that celebrated eternity would face its end. The final celebration thundered through the streets of Atlantis. But outside the city's walls, the horizon began to change. What had once been a distant line of calm sea and sky transformed into something unfamiliar, something heavy. The darkness did not come like a storm cloud rolling in. It came like a curtain, slow and deliberate, swallowing the edge of the world. Fishermen along the coast were the first to notice. They pointed toward the horizon, their voices trembling as they described a shadow. It was not smoke, not mist, not cloud. It was something deeper, a darkness that seemed to bend the air itself. The revelers in the city ignored it at first. Fireworks lit the sky, music roared, and laughter drowned out the warnings. But as the shadow spread, even the most joyous dancers faltered. The torches flickered strangely, their flames bending toward the sea, as though pulled by an unseen force. The air grew heavier, pressing against lungs, making every breath feel shallow. Astronomers rushed to their towers, scanning the horizon with instruments. What they saw defied explanation. The stars near the horizon vanished, swallowed by the encroaching dark. The moon's reflection on the ocean fractured, breaking into shards of light that rippled unnaturally across the waves. Priests declared it a sign, the gods turning their faces away from Atlantis. Sailors whispered of storms beyond imagination, of waves taller than towers. But the leaders, desperate to maintain control, insisted it was nothing more than nature's trick. They ordered calm, demanded silence, and proclaimed that Atlantis would stand forever. Yet the horizon did not obey. The darkness grew thicker, closer, heavier. It was not storm, not cloud, not smoke. It was something else, something that carried the weight of inevitability. The ocean reflected it, shimmering with distorted light, as if the sea itself was swallowing the sky. The horizon darkens, not with battle, not with fire, but with silence. And though the city still celebrated, the truth was undeniable. Something vast, something unstoppable, was approaching. By dawn, the horizon would no longer be distant. It would be upon them. And Atlantis, blind in its arrogance, would face the shadow it had ignored. The horizon had already darkened, but the true terror began when the earth itself stirred. At first, it was subtle, a tremor so faint that dancers in the plazas mistook it for the rhythm of drums. Goblets rattled on banquet tables, torches flickered against marble walls, and laughter briefly faltered before resuming. The people told themselves it was nothing, but the tremor returned, stronger. The ground beneath Atlantis groaned, a deep vibration that seemed to rise from the ocean floor itself. Bridges shuddered, canals rippled violently, and towers swayed with a grace that was anything but natural. The city, built on foundations believed to be eternal, was suddenly alive with movement. In the harbors, ships slammed against their moorings as the water surged unpredictably. Sailors shouted warnings, their voices drowned by the roar of shifting currents. Fishermen dropped their nets, staring in horror as the sea itself seemed to pulse, rising and falling in waves that carried no wind. Inside the temples, priests fell silent mid-prayer, their chants broken by the vibration that shook the marble beneath their knees. They whispered of God's stirring, of forces awakening, of judgments long delayed but now inevitable. Astronomers abandoned their charts, rushing to towers to witness the horizon bending, the stars trembling as if shaken by unseen hands. The leaders, desperate to maintain control, ordered calm. They told the people it was nothing more than the earth adjusting, but their voices cracked, betraying fear. They had felt the tremor too, and they knew it was not ordinary. The first shift was not destruction, it was warning. It was the earth whispering that eternity was an illusion. Atlantis's foundations were not as unshakable as its people believed. The tremor was the beginning, the first crack. The people tried to continue their celebration, but unease spread. Musicians faltered, dancers stumbled. Laughter faded into silence. The city that had believed itself eternal now stood on ground that refused to stay still. By dawn, the tremors would no longer be whispers, they would be shouts. And Atlantis, blind in its arrogance, would face the truth. The earth itself had turned against them. The tremors had begun, subtle at first, then undeniable. The people of Atlantis found themselves torn between two instincts, to flee in terror or to cling to the illusion of safety. In the streets, panic spread like fire. Families rushed to gather belongings. Children cried as parents pulled them toward the harbors. Merchants abandoned their stalls, their treasures spilling into the canals as they ran. Sailors shouted warnings, urging anyone who would listen to leave before the ocean rose. The city's heartbeat shifted from celebration to chaos, but denial was just as strong. Many refused to believe disaster was coming. Priests reassured worshippers that the gods would protect them, that silence was not judgment but blessing. Leaders proclaimed Atlantis eternal, their voices trembling as they demanded calm. The city split in two. One half ran, driven by fear, their footsteps echoing through streets that had once been filled with music. The other half stayed, clinging to pride, their voices rising in defiance against the warnings. Panic and denial collided, creating a chaos more dangerous than either alone. In the harbors, ships filled quickly, their decks crowded with families desperate to flee. But the ocean resisted, its currents twisting, its waves rising unpredictably. Some ships capsized before they could leave, swallowed by waters that no longer obeyed human command. In the plazas, denial grew louder. Musicians played again, their songs trembling but defiant. Dancers spun, their movements frantic, as if joy could erase fear. Leaders shouted promises of safety, demanding the people trust in Atlantis's eternal strength. But beneath their words, the tremors continued, shaking the ground, rattling the towers, whispering the truth. The choice was clear: panic or denial, flee or stay, believe or ignore. Yet both paths led to the same fate. The ocean was restless, the sky was shifting, the silence was pressing. Atlantis was no longer eternal. By dawn, panic would become desperation, denial would become regret, and the city, torn between fear and pride, would face the collapse together. The tremors that unsettled Atlantis were only the beginning. The horizon darkened, the ocean grew restless. Faint vibrations beneath marble floors escalated into violent shifts. No song, no prayer, no denial could silence them. The first great quake struck without warning. Towers swayed like reeds, bridges cracked, canals surged. Streets rippled as if liquid, sending merchants and families stumbling in terror. The city trembled under forces it could not command. In the harbors, ships slammed against one another, masts splintering. Waves rose in chaotic bursts, swallowing docks. Sailors clung to ropes, their voices drowned by the roar of collapsing wood and stone. The ocean moved with the earth. Inside temples, priests fell as statues toppled, shattering against marble. The silence was broken by destruction. Walls split, towers cracked, voices screamed. The gods did not answer. The earth spoke louder. Astronomers abandoned charts, rushing from swaying towers. The heavens offered no comfort. Stars flickered, constellations bent, the moon trembled. The universe turned against Atlantis. Leaders shouted orders no one could follow, their voices drowned by collapsing stone. Guards rushed to protect chambers, but even walls of power cracked. The illusion of eternity shattered. People panicked, fleeing through streets that split beneath their feet. Merchants abandoned treasures, priests prayers, nobles abandoned pride. The city that celebrated eternity now ran in terror, its foundations crumbling. The earth had begun to move, and with it, the truth was undeniable. Atlantis was not eternal. It was fragile, vulnerable, and powerless against forces greater than itself. By dawn, the tremors would no longer be warnings, they would be destruction, and Atlantis, once proud and eternal, would face the collapse it had ignored. The earth had begun to move, but the heavens were no less merciless. As Atlantis trembled beneath quakes, the sky itself turned hostile. What had once been a canopy of stars became a shifting storm of light and shadow, a theater of omens that no one could deny. The moon, once steady, grew distorted. Its glow fractured into shards, casting broken reflections across the restless ocean. Constellations twisted, their familiar patterns dissolving into chaos. Astronomers stood helpless as their maps became meaningless. The sky was rewriting itself, and Atlantis was powerless to stop it. Then came the colors. Strange hues bled across the horizon, crimson streaks, violet swirls, and a sickly green glow, spreading like a wound. People gathered in plazas, staring upward in awe and terror. Some whispered of divine wrath, others of unnatural forces, but all agreed the sky was no longer theirs. Thunder rolled without clouds. Lightning split the heavens in jagged arcs, striking the ocean with blinding fury. Each bolt illuminated the trembling city, revealing towers swaying, bridges cracking, and faces frozen in fear. The air itself seemed charged, humming with vibration. Priests declared the gods had turned their gaze away, abandoning Atlantis to its fate. Sailors spoke of storms, waves taller than towers, winds that could tear stone apart. Leaders insisted it was spectacle, not omen, but their voices shook, betraying the truth they refused to admit. The sky was not simply changing, it was warning. Every flicker of light, every fracture of the moon, every unnatural color was a message. Atlantis's time was ending. The heavens, once steady and eternal, now mirrored the chaos of the earth and sea. The people, torn between awe and terror, stood frozen beneath the shifting sky. Some prayed, some fled, some laughed in denial. But none could escape the truth. The heavens had turned against them. By dawn, the sky would no longer be a canvas of stars. It would be a storm, a verdict, a force that sealed Atlantis's fate. The tremors had grown violent. The sky had twisted into colors no one had ever seen, and the ocean surged with unnatural fury. Atlantis stood at the threshold, the moment when survival was no longer possible. This was the point of no return. The city's towers, once radiant symbols of eternity, cracked under the strain. Marble split, crystals dimmed. Bridges collapsed into canals that overflowed with restless water. The streets became rivers of chaos. Families fled in desperation. The celebration was over. The illusion was shattered. The ocean rose higher, swallowing docks and flooding warehouses. Ships that had once promised escape were torn apart. Currents moved with deliberate violence. Sailors screamed as waves towered above them, crashing down with force. The sea, once Atlantis's ally, had become its executioner. Above, the sky burned with unnatural light. Lightning split the heavens in jagged arcs, striking towers, igniting fires that spread uncontrollably. The moon fractured into distorted reflections, casting broken shadows across the trembling city. The heavens now mirrored the chaos below. Inside the council chambers, leaders shouted orders that no one could follow. Guards abandoned their posts, priests abandoned their prayers, and nobles abandoned their pride. Rulers faced the truth. Their decisions sealed the city's fate. The people, torn between panic and denial, ran through streets that split beneath their feet. Some fled toward the harbors, desperate for escape. Others clung to temples, begging gods who no longer answered. But all faced the same reality. Atlantis had crossed the threshold. There was no turning back. The point of no return was not a single moment. It was the culmination of arrogance, denial, and ignored warnings. It was the earth, the sea, and the sky conspiring together to remind Atlantis that eternity does not belong to empires. It belongs to silence, to forces greater than pride, to the inevitability of collapse. By dawn, Atlantis would no longer be a city. It would be a memory, a legend, a warning. There was no escape. The city of Atlantis had crossed the point of no return. The earth trembled, the ocean surged, and the sky burned with unnatural light. Yet, in the final breath before destruction, silence returned, heavier, deeper, more absolute than ever before. The people froze. Families clutched one another in the streets. Sailors gripped ropes on ships that no longer obeyed the sea. Priests knelt in temples that shook with every tremor. The silence pressed against them all, a suffocating stillness. It seemed to hold the entire city in suspension. It was the moment before impact, the pause between warning and catastrophe. The towers stood fractured, their foundations groaning, their crystals dimming. Bridges hung broken over canals that surged unpredictably. Fires flickered across plazas, their flames bending toward the ocean as though pulled by unseen hands. Yet nothing moved. The silence was total, as if the world itself had stopped to watch. Eyes turned to the horizon. The darkness that had swallowed the edge of the world now loomed closer, vast and unrelenting. It was not storm, not cloud, not smoke. It was something greater, something inevitable, something that carried the weight of finality. The people stared, breathless, knowing the shadow was no longer distant. It was here. In that moment, Atlantis was united, not in celebration, not in denial, but in fear. Nobles, merchants, sailors, priests, children, all stood together beneath the trembling sky, waiting for the impact they could not escape. The silence was not mercy, it was anticipation. The moment before impact was the city's last heartbeat, a pause so profound it seemed to stretch into eternity. A final chance to feel the weight of what was about to come. Atlantis had ignored the signs, dismissed the warnings, clung to illusions. Now there was nothing left but silence. By dawn, the silence would shatter, the impact would arrive, and Atlantis, once eternal, would fall. The tremors had shaken Atlantis, the ocean had surged, and the sky had burned with unnatural light. Yet, just before the collapse began, silence spread once more, deeper, heavier, and more complete than any that had come before. It was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of inevitability. Every street, every hall, every canal fell still. Families huddled together, their voices hushed, their breaths shallow. Merchants abandoned treasures, staring at the unmoving air as if sound itself had fled. Priests knelt in temples, their prayers swallowed by the silence. Even the leaders, once defiant, stood frozen, their words trapped in throats that refused to speak. The silence was everywhere. It pressed against the towers, seeped into the canals, lingered in the plazas. Fires flickered without crackle, waves rose without roar, tremors pulsed without echo. The city was suspended, caught between existence and destruction, between arrogance and truth. For the people of Atlantis, the silence was unbearable. Children cried without sound. Mothers held them tighter. Fathers stared at the horizon with hollow eyes. Sailors gripped ropes, waiting for waves that did not yet strike. Nobles clutched jewels that no longer mattered. The silence was not absence, it was presence, a force heavier than stone, stronger than pride. It was the city's final breath. Atlantis had ignored the warnings, dismissed the omens, clung to illusions. Now, in the silence across the city, every soul felt the truth. Eternity was gone. The silence was not mercy. It was the pause before destruction, the moment when the world itself seemed to hold its breath. By dawn, the silence would shatter. And when it did, Atlantis would fall. The silence that had spread across Atlantis shattered in an instant. The earth roared. the ocean surged, and the sky split open with fury. What had been warnings, tremors, and omens now became reality. The collapse had begun. The ground convulsed violently, splitting streets into jagged chasms. Towers that had stood for centuries crumbled, their marble foundations snapping like brittle bone. Bridges collapsed into canals that overflowed with torrents of water, sweeping away merchants, families, and treasures alike. The city that had believed itself eternal was breaking apart beneath its own weight. The ocean struck next. Waves rose higher than towers, crashing into harbors with unstoppable force. Ships were torn apart, their fragments hurled against stone walls. The canals surged, flooding plazas and temples, swallowing streets in a tide that carried both debris and despair. The sea, once Atlantis's ally, had become its executioner. Above, the sky burned with chaos. Lightning split the heavens in jagged arcs, striking towers already weakened by tremors. Thunder rolled without clouds, shaking the air with deafening force. The moon fractured into distorted reflections, casting broken shadows across the collapsing city. The heavens, once steady, now mirrored the destruction below. The people screamed. Panic consumed the streets as families fled in every direction, searching for escape that no longer existed. Priests cried out to gods who did not answer. Leaders shouted orders that no one could follow, their voices drowned by the roar of destruction. The city was united in terror. The collapse was not gradual. It was relentless, merciless, unstoppable. Every tremor, every wave, every bolt of lightning carried the weight of inevitability. Atlantis had ignored the warnings, dismissed the omens, clung to illusions. Now, the forces of earth, sea, and sky conspired together to erase it. By dawn, Atlantis would no longer stand. Its towers would be rubble, its canals would be rivers, its plazas would be silence. The collapse had begun, and there was no salvation. When the collapse began, not all were lost in the first wave of destruction. A handful of survivors witnessed the fall of Atlantis with eyes wide in horror. Sailors clinging to broken ships, families who fled to higher ground, priests who escaped crumbling temples. They saw towers crumble like sandcastles, their marble foundations snapping as if they had never been strong. They saw bridges collapse into canals that surged with violent floods, carrying away treasures, voices, and lives. They saw plazas once filled with laughter swallowed by water, their fires extinguished in an instant. From the harbors, survivors watched waves rise higher than the tallest towers, crashing down with a force that shattered stone. Ships were torn apart, their fragments hurled against walls before vanishing into the sea. The ocean, once a source of life, became a graveyard of wood, stone, and memory. Above, the sky burned with unnatural light. Lightning split the heavens, illuminating the destruction in flashes of brilliance. The moon fractured into distorted reflections, casting broken shadows across the ruins. Survivors whispered that the heavens themselves had turned against Atlantis, sealing its fate. And then came the silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of aftermath. The roar of collapse faded, leaving only the sound of water swallowing what remained. Survivors stood frozen, staring at the ruins of a city that had once believed itself eternal. What they saw was not just destruction. It was the end of arrogance, the fall of pride, the unraveling of illusion. Atlantis had ignored the warnings, dismissed the omens, clung to eternity. Now, survivors saw the truth. Nothing lasts forever. By dawn, Atlantis was gone. All that remained were fragments, memories, and survivors who carried the story. A story of a city that believed it was eternal and fell because of it. Atlantis fell in a single night, a city that believed itself eternal, undone by silence, by arrogance, by forces greater than pride. Its collapse was not just an end, but a lesson echoing across centuries, that night still matters, reminding us of fragility. No matter how strong the towers, how advanced the technology, eternity does not belong to human hands. It belongs to forces beyond control: the earth, the sea, the sky, and time itself. It matters because it shows the danger of denial. Atlantis was warned, in the stars, in the restless ocean, but its leaders chose pride over caution, celebration over preparation. The city fell because it refused to listen. An unseen presence, a vast, patient entity, quietly weakened Atlantis from the shadows, exploiting their arrogance. Survivors carried the story. They saw towers crumble, oceans rise, skies burn. Their voices became legend, a tale passed through generations, a warning to every empire that believes itself eternal. Atlantis is not just a city of the past. It is a mirror. Every civilization that builds towers of pride, every leader who silences warnings, every people who cling to illusions, they all walk the path of Atlantis. The story endures because the lesson endures. That night still matters because it was not just the end of Atlantis. It was the reminder that nothing lasts forever. Eternity belongs not to empires, but to silence, to memory, to the forces that wait patiently for arrogance to falter. Atlantis fell, but its story remains. And that story is the warning: listen or fall.